Welcome back, everybody. Today I'm looking forward to doing a job I've been putting off for quite a while, and that's converting this Kinetic splitter to a diesel engine. And really the reason I'm doing it now is just because these engines have become so prevalent on eBay, and I believe you can get them on Amazon. They're about 250 bucks shipped to your door. Gives you the advantages that the diesel can bring to a piece of equipment like this. Kinetic wood splitter is probably one of the best examples, in my opinion, of where the diesel engine can really shine, because not only do you have the inherent additional efficiencies that the Kinetic log splitter has over the hydraulic, you couple that with a reliable diesel unit and you should have a long-term good solution for splitting wood for years to come without the issues that go along with fuel and possible hard starting that brings along with gasoline engines. So we'll go ahead and see what it takes to put this engine on here, and then we'll see what sort of differences they might have. We'll go over the advantages and disadvantages that the diesel engine might have versus the gasoline, and then we'll split up a little bit of wood. It's heating season, of course, and I'll try and make the most out of this and get some wood split at the same time. One of the things that you guys might pick up on is that this engine's only rated at about 3.5 or 4 horse. It says 4 on it, which I'm assuming is 4 PS, which is roughly 4 horsepower. I think it's advertised on eBay as a 3 horsepower, depending on the speed you run it, potentially. And I believe they're set at about 3,000 RPM to run. You might be able to run that up a little more. Versus the engines that typically come on these Kinetic log splitters, they're usually in the 5 to 7 horsepower range, depending on the size of them. If they're a gasoline engine, you might see them as well equipped with electric motors, and we might talk about that a little bit later, and some of the similarities among all the engines that are suited for a Kinetic wood splitter. So let's go ahead and we'll take a quick walk around on this. I'll give you a few comments and we'll get going and split up a little bit of wood just to see how it runs with the gasoline engine. I haven't ran this in about 4 or 5 months. I bought it about 4 or 5 months ago, had whatever fuel was in it. I don't suspect it's going to be giving me problems already. I'd be very surprised, and I'm certainly not staging anything if it doesn't start. I really want it to start because my focus is to get the diesel engine on there, not to focus on why the gasoline engine might not start. But if it doesn't, it's probably due to a carburetor and or old fuel in it, but don't suspect that'll be a problem as of yet. But we'll do a quick walk around and then we'll get started. So this is a Power King Kinetic log splitter. It's advertised as having a 34-ton max force splitting capability, which I question where that value comes from. I also have a 35-ton hydraulic splitter, and I'll tell you now that this will not produce the splitting force that 35-ton hydraulic does. And to get 34-ton, generally they tend to use 75-pound flywheels, I've noticed, for the other similar Kinetic splitters that are rated to a similar force. The other thing they have on here is a Kohler command. I actually thought it was a Briggs & Stratton, but it's a Kohler. It's actually a nice little engine, runs great. So far I haven't really split a lot with it, and bought it used, of course. The interesting thing about the diesel engine is it's also made in China, as is the Power King, to the best of my knowledge. And it almost makes you wonder why the Chinese didn't get together, the two companies, or somebody from one of each, and put the Chinese diesel onto the Kinetic splitter versus sending these over to have them powered with something more domestic, I guess, although I don't know if that Kohler is actually made in China either, because I think that would be a great package and they could probably turn that into some higher profits as a package. I've noticed if you buy the orange engines, and these two engines come in either the the orange or red color. The red ones tend to have the plastic air filter on them, and I only bought one of those, but it did come with the keyway and the crankshaft bolt. The orange ones don't seem to come with those, so that's something to keep in mind. I don't know if that's always the case, but it was with the one I bought. And so you'll need some key stock. It's a 5x5 millimeter. This came from Zorro, I believe. And then you'll want to get your 20 millimeter diameter double groove pulley. This, you don't have a lot of options to change the diameter, at least not for this price. I think this is only like $7 or $8 off eBay, and fits on there good. There may be a problem with how long the shaft is, and I'll have to get into that later. We'll talk about it and what we might need to do to fix that. And again, you'll have to get the bolt for this if it didn't come with it, and I can't remember what size it is. I think it's an M8. I don't remember the pitch on it. We'll get into what is existing on here. I had it apart. It is a double pulley belt drive system. Depending on where the engine or the crankshaft lands, you might need to get a different set of belts that are a different length to fit, but hopefully we can reuse the same ones if there's enough adjustability and the engine happens to land with a shaft in the same spot. I did measure the height of this, and it will fit underneath here. It's actually a little bit shorter than this one. You can see that they got it pretty close to the housing of the rack. And I was actually thinking that it may not fit under there, but it does. It's going to be a little wider this way versus the Kohler that's in there. I don't know really what else to say about it. That I hope that the rack and pinion on these are pretty good, because I did have a Speedco, I think it was, sold by Tractor Supply, and that had problems with the rack on it, breaking teeth, as well as one I saw that was a DR splitter, a K75, similar rating, and guy I knew had it. He went through a couple racks on it. They broke the teeth off. So that's one downside to these Kinetic splitters, it seems, is that they tend to break the teeth off the racks. And I can't even pull that one out. It's a little bit stiff, but you can kind of see it here. These are a little bit heavier teeth than what's on the Speedco, but it's also a little narrower and a little taller, which adds some strength from bending up or down, which helps. And we'll see how well it does over time. What else can I tell you about this? The engine on here, one thing I don't like about it, that it comes with a shutoff here, and that's essentially how you start and shut off the engine, is through the fuel supply, which because I despise the fuel being left in the carburetor, I always try and run that out and shut the fuel off. And in this case, there's no fuel shut off other than this one. I could put one in there, but you end up killing the engine and shutting the fuel off at the carburetor, but you never essentially burn it out of the carburetor. And it's one thing I don't like about that is you can't really run it out while the engine's on. But some of these engines seem to be designed better than others. They seem to be more tolerant of older fuel, and of course when it gets old enough that it's not going to burn, it doesn't matter what the design of the engine is. But some of them are less susceptible to having carburetor oxidation because of the ethanol that's in the fuels today, if you're buying ethanol fuel. And that's about it. We're going to go ahead and start this up, or try and start it up. I don't expect it to be giving us any trouble as far as starting this time, and we'll run a couple of logs through it and see kind of what the cycle time is. Again, we're going from a 7 horsepower down to roughly 3 or 3.5 horsepower. And we'll take a look at how that really affects the practical cycle time of this machine. Let's talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of diesel engine conversions. For the advantages, you're going to notice a slight increase in efficiency when you're dealing with smaller engines and tools and equipment. This isn't going to be life-altering savings in terms of fuel costs, and of course the price of diesel is somewhat higher in general than regular gasoline in general, but again, you can get off-road diesel, which I would recommend. You can save a little bit there. Usually get it underneath the cost of gasoline, and I don't know places that sell off-road gasoline. So there's one advantage you will see with the efficiency of the engine and the ability to get the fuel at or less than the price of gasoline. It is going to be very small savings, but something you may notice. And really that savings or noticeability shows up when you get to run longer for the same volume of fuel. You'll have less fill-ups to do. You may be able to run all day depending on how much wood you're trying to process. The big driver, of course, is the fuel longevity. Diesel has the ability to be stored much longer than gasoline. Personally, I don't have a lot of experience with both, but I do know I've seen equipment that had at least some of the fuel in there for up to a couple decades, and it still ran, started just fine. There was no disadvantage or degradation of the engine performance because the fuel was that old. My understanding is the more recent diesel fuels are not as quote good as they used to be. It seems like most of that has to do with desulfurization of the fuel, and so that sulfur being removed does have a tendency to have the fuel not last as long. But in general, you're going to expect much longer life out of your diesel fuel versus your gasoline in terms of the ability to combust and not cause some of the corrosion that may be associated with gasolines, especially those that have ethanol mixed in with them. Another advantage for diesels is you may be able to run an alternate fuel in them. Diesels historically have been associated with being more of a multi-fuel engine than gasoline. I don't have a lot of experience with this, but the potential's there. The potentials to run a biofuel or vegetable oil should be there with these, although I haven't personally tried that. But for the people that are really want to have their independence, you do have the potential to burn alternate fuels. Of course, with the gasoline engines, you can also burn gasified wood, which there's a lot of information out on the internet on how to do, and there's other videos on that. It definitely works, and that gives a competing advantage to the gasoline engine. Of course, the reliability, and I have to be careful with that because these newer engines, such as this one we're trying to retrofit, is a Chinese manufacturing, which notoriously or has historically been known for not having the quality control, quality assurance necessarily as, say, a HOTS made from Germany. So as far as reliability mechanically versus a gasoline engine, I wouldn't look for any there, and you may actually find out that these don't run as long as a good Briggs & Stratton gasoline engine. But you are going to see that reliability improvement related to the fuel, which is the second point that we made here and the big driver for all of this, in my case. If you're the type of person that likes to roll coal, there is a possibility here. Not something that is desirable to me. I really would rather it not be able to do that, but so be it if that's what you're looking to do. And it's kind of unique and has the cool factor that, hey, this is something you really just can't go buy. I don't know a place that sells log splitters, at least the homeowners size ones that come with diesel engines. I think there's bigger ones that come with diesels for hydraulics and things like that. But your homeowner grade type log splitter, both hydraulic, kinetic, and other brands are or other types, I should say, are going to come with a gasoline engine. So here's an opportunity to put a cheap diesel on there and have that uniqueness go along with it. Some of the disadvantages, of course, the cost, and it's not that huge, and this engine that we're looking at actually gives us a pretty good, let me get it pulled up here. You're looking at a cost of about $250 to get this to your doorstep. I think that's very reasonable for a diesel engine, considering it has a high tolerance precision pump on it, as opposed to the parts made to make a gasoline engine. $250 as opposed to, let's look at, you can go buy a Predator engine, and a lot of times you can see these, they'll come up for $99. I don't know how recent that is, and with the congestion and shipping costs that have gone up as of late, it's probably influencing these prices to go a little bit higher. So this is, you're looking, if you wanted to go pick this up today, you're going to pay $150 for it versus the $250 for the diesel engine. Is it worth the extra $100? In my opinion, it is. And so it's good to see that gap narrow between a economically priced gasoline engine versus a economically priced diesel. Now, again, we're not really apples to apples here. We're looking at a diesel engine that has less than half the advertised horsepower of this Predator. It's going to weigh more. It's going to be a little bit bigger. But again, taking some of the advantages into account, it may be worth that extra cost to invest in the diesel. Conversion time, you're going to have to spend a little bit of time to pull the old gasoline engine off, and then of course you're going to have to either sell that or store it somewhere. It's going to most likely require some modification of the bolting or the base, which hopefully is just a matter of drilling holes. You may need to increase the size of the base. All that's going to add time to do the conversion when you may have a perfectly running gasoline engine on there now. You're going to get some more smoke with the diesel, which could be an advantage if you are looking to roll coal. I am not a big fan of any more smoke or noise than I need necessary to get the job done. But you are going to see that a little bit more smoke from the diesel, and you're going to see a little bit more noise in general. You're going to get the rattle at the low RPM, the shaking, the vibration. At the higher RPM, you're going to see probably a few more decibels than you are versus the gasoline engine, but probably not big enough to really take a lot of notice to those things, but they are more in the case of the diesel. We mentioned that a little bit earlier, the lower power to weight and size ratio. You're looking at half the power of a comparably sized gasoline engine. And that will come into play more along with the lines of a snowblower, potentially a rototiller, versus this kinetic log splitter. And you would see that very distinctly with a hydraulic log splitter if you opt to put a diesel engine on that. Hydraulic log splitters are much more inefficient just because of all the losses that are inherent with hydraulic systems, and they tend to gobble up a lot more horsepower, about all you can throw at them. I have a 35-ton gasoline powered horizontal vertical hydraulic splitter that's has a 12 horsepower engine on it, and it uses a lot of fuel and it tends to run hot, the whole system, so there's a lot of losses there. So you can get away with that with these Kinetics because they are much more efficient, but keep in mind that you are going to have a lower power to weight ratio and size with the diesel that can end up impacting how well your equipment operates in the end. I don't expect that to be much of a problem with this Kinetic, and there's some inherent things with the Kinetic that lend itself well to using a diesel. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we explore the conversion. You're going to have some cold weather concerns if you want to run this thing in the heart of winter. Maybe not so much in the engine starting as long as the fuel is not gelled, but if you do get below that 0 degrees Fahrenheit or whatever the gel point is of the fuel that you happen to be using, you're going to be into some trouble if you don't find a way to heat that up. I had some other videos that talked more about cold weather starting provisions for these engines, but bottom line is if you have a can of ether, you're going to be fine unless the weather's really, really cold, and if that's the case, you might just want to wait till it gets above 0 to go out and do some wood splitting unless you have to. One other disadvantage that you might not think about, but it's a real one, is bleeding the fuel system when you're out of fuel. Most likely with these Kinetic splitters, you're going to run them until they run out of fuel. That's pretty much what I do with all my splitters, because it's something you just don't watch. Unless you put a gauge on it, you're not going to know how much is in there. You're going to tend to start it up, maybe not always fill it up every time, and you're going to run it till it's out. And in the case of these smaller diesels or any of the diesels, generally you got to bleed the system. The HOTS has an auto bleed in it, so it can be treated much the same as a gasoline engine. You just fill it up and it auto bleeds, which is nice. These engines from China don't have that. You have to bleed the system up to the pump, which is just a matter of loosening the banjo bolt a turn or so, watching the air come out of it until you get a stream of fuel, then tightening it back up. And I have another video I can link that shows, parts of it show on how you can bleed the system. So it's not that bad, but you do got to have a wrench with you, the right size to do that. Otherwise, you're not going to get it going again. And this one I threw on there because I had an instance as of late where I have a diesel car now. Take advantage of that higher fuel mileage. And I was running out of fuel and had to fuel up, and stopped at a town it wasn't a very small town. It should have been a decent enough sized town that there should have been plenty of fuel stations that offered diesel. But I found it a little more difficult than what it should have been. I stopped at the first gas station. They didn't have any diesel fuel. I drove over to the second one. They didn't have any diesel fuel pumps. And at that point, I was getting low enough where I didn't want to keep doing that until I was out of fuel and have my own problems trying to bleed that system and get it running again. So I started making some phone calls. I called the first place, and I asked them if they had diesel. They said no. And I asked them where's a station that sells diesel. They said they didn't know. And I thought, boy, for people that live and work in that town, especially at a fuel station, you'd think they would know where the nearest diesel fuel station was, but they didn't. And luckily I kept making phone calls. I found a Meyer that had one pump available out of about a dozen that sold diesel. And it dawned on me then that diesel isn't necessarily as readily available as what you might think it is, or what you might be used to with gasoline. Probably not a big disadvantage, but something to keep in mind depending on where you're going. Make sure you either take enough fuel along for what you want to do, or make sure you have a station nearby that sells diesel. Otherwise, you'll be left with gasoline only. was running the engine at full speed just to make sure I was utilizing the highest speed I could. And if it says on the sticker, it says it's rated at 4,000 RPM. The diesel engine only runs at 3,000 RPM, so you're looking at about a 25% reduction in speed rate off the top. So it is going to be a little slower overall just because of that speed reduction. And that could be compensated for by installing a little larger drive pulley. Unfortunately, because of the one that's available, which is this one, I believe it's very close. In fact, it may actually be a little bit smaller in diameter than the one that's on there, and we'll get into that next and take a look at it. But we're somewhat limited with that, and I don't want to speed the diesel up around 4,000 RPM because it's just not going to be looking at saving that much time, in my opinion. But we'll see the comparison. Hopefully when we get it on there and get it running and see how much slower it actually is and what effect the 4 horsepower loss has on the splitting ability. Alright, now we can actually see what's going on in here. I do like the fact that we have a belt tensioner that will compensate for different lengths of belt, give us some adjustability there, which means it's likely we won't have to get new belts. I'm a little amazed that there's no grooves in the flywheels, although I think I've seen that on the DR Kinetic as well. So it's interesting they stay on. Let's look at this pulley. There's something I see here too I don't like, is the length of this shaft. It looks like from the face of the engine, the shaft needs to be about 3.5 inches long, and we don't have 3.5 inches there, maybe 2.5. So we're about 1 inch short there, so we'll have to come up with something to get that extended out. The good news is maybe it looks like this is a slightly bigger diameter than the pulley that's on there, which is good. That means we'll get those flywheels up to a slightly higher speed at the lower engine RPM, so it'll compensate a little bit. Probably not enough. And I guess I could measure the diameters to get a ratio and see how much we can compensate for that difference in engine speed. But for now, we'll go ahead and get these belts off and get this pulley and spacer off here just to see how they actually did that, because I don't think this is complete shaft all the way through here either off of this engine, and maybe we can reuse this bushing or spacer in some fashion. At this point, there's nothing really holding the engine on, which makes this a very easy and clean conversion, other than the mounting bolts, which we'll get out. No fuel lines going to a tank or electrical or anything like that. And we may be able to actually take that base plate off and bolt it directly onto the diesel. We'll just have to see what it looks like when we get it apart. We're at it here too. Let's compare these sheave sizes. Now I can't really measure the pitch diameter, which is somewhere in here. I'm just gonna measure the OD and use that for a relative. And we're looking at 1.75, say 1.745 versus 2.13. 1.745 to 2.130, so that's roughly the ratio between those two. And I don't have my calculator My phone's charging, so I can't run the numbers on that, but it's not quite. That's probably about the right diameter to make up for that speed difference, which is really cool. Now what would be really cool is that the bolt pattern of this engine bolted up to the holes that are existing in this plate. But if they don't, we should be able to easily transfer them and drill new ones. So I don't see any showstoppers here. And so far, it's looking pretty good. How about on this side? Yeah, we might be able to be in business. Yeah, I think we'll be good. Thankfully, the patterns are standard, and you don't want to make these too tight. You want to have some ability to slip, because you'll end up burning these belts since there's no other means of slipping other than belt tension. And we can always crank it up a little more after we start using it if we find out that the slip is too much. And so I'm just going to set it there for now. Still got a fair amount of play in it, plus the tensioners trying to take up the difference. We'll get this locked down and we'll run it a little bit without the guard just to see what things look like here before we put the guard back on and cover up some potential problems we might have. Alright, we should be mounted up. Looks like the belts are tracking reasonably well, at least for initial start. Everything's bolted down. We have fuel, oil, although we need to check the oil, and let's see if we can actually check the oil on here. It's going to run into some other part of the splitter, which it won't, which is great. Make sure none of our oil ran out. And we got a full stick. Let's see if we can get it going. This hasn't ran since I bought it, probably 5 or 6 months ago, and I did have fuel sitting in it. It's about 50 degrees Fahrenheit outside. We'll see if we can get it to start without any starting aids. I suspect at 50 it shouldn't be too bad. The other thing you might notice is that the clearance between here and the filler cap is a little bit more, so it'll actually make it a little bit easier to fill that up versus the other one. Which means this engine's a little bit shorter than the Kohler, but a little bit wider. But fits nice, almost like it was made for the splitter. Let's see how many pulls it's going to take. Alright, one thing I don't like about this splitter compared to some of the other Kinetics I operate is it doesn't ease into the rack into the pinion, as you noticed. And I don't know if every Power King is this way or it's just this one. But yeah, you really got to jam it in and it tends to want to grind those rack and pinion gears together, which I'm not a big fan of, but we'll give it some run time and see. We'll get the guard back on, take it over there and see how it splits. It's getting a little darker. I was hoping to be done a little bit earlier, but there's always tomorrow if we don't get a chance to run it today. And of course we can't forget the finishing touches, and something that will maybe prevent somebody from putting the wrong fuel in someday. You always want to get yourself a pack of these if you're going to be doing these conversions. Alright, first time with the diesel. Let's pay attention to the cycle time and see how much different it really is, and if it's going to impact our working time. And let's just see the overall performance. Well, there you have it. Pretty straightforward installation. I lost maybe about an hour and a half building the adapter I didn't need. So watching this video will maybe save you some time if you watch the whole thing. And bottom line is it's a pretty easy, straightforward installation. Shouldn't have any problems. Shouldn't really have to buy anything more than a pulley and a M8 by 40 bolt and a 5mm key. and it should be pretty well plug and play. Alright, so pretty successful installation. Having that pulley a little bit larger, I really didn't notice any difference in speed when it's fully turned up. In fact, slowing it down a little bit is almost as good, really not losing too much time. Therefore, having half the horsepower is really not a big deal for a kinetic splitter application. And you'll notice that a lot of kinetic splitters can be purchased with an electric motor, and if you look at the horsepower rating of electric motor, a lot of them are only 1.5 horse, and they seem to do just fine. Again, I don't know necessarily why they put the 6 or 7 horsepower engine on there. I will say too that if you run into a log that absorbs all the energy from the flywheels, you're really only left with the mechanical advantage from the engine through the belt and pinion, rack and pinion system, and that's where having the available torque there at whatever speed you're running can help plow you through the rest of that. But otherwise, there's really no big advantage to have that high horsepower. And in fact, it's another example of where the diesel can be pretty efficient compared to the gasoline engine, because since the gasoline engine is not really using a lot of horsepower the whole time, the butterfly on the carburetor is closed, so you're losing a lot of losses, or you're experiencing some losses through the throttling of the carburetor, which you won't have with the diesel. And I wouldn't be surprised that a full tank of fuel on here, even though this tank isn't really that big, I wouldn't be surprised that you could split for 4 to 6 hours and maybe even 8 on a tank of fuel, depending on how much wood you can actually run through there. And yeah, so good example of what can be done. I'm probably going to do 1 or 2 more of these in the future. I'm kind of wondering about the future of these engines. They're pretty readily available right now. The price is great. I would say pick some up if you have any inclination that you might use them in the future. There's some interesting legislation coming through on banning internal combustion engines in California, it looks like, where a lot of the homeowners are going to be limited to electric powered things with batteries or corded. And I'm not necessarily opposed to those things, and in the end I do think we're going to look back and wonder how we dealt with the internal combustion engines and the complexity of them, the maintenance, the smoke, and the things that go along with that. But for now, we still got them. Pick them up, put them on rotor tillers, snow blowers, log splitters, mini bikes. What other ideas are you guys using these engines for? It'd be really nice if they had a vertical shaft version of this for push lawnmowers and things like that, but we'll take what we can get for now. Alright, what you guys have been in suspense for the whole video so far, let's go ahead and roll some coal. And none of this would be possible without the diesel Kinetic log splitter. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next project.